I have never had so much interest about speaking to someone. So I mentioned it to my mum and some family and some friends, and they just had so many questions. I'm not sure if there was like the right questions because it's quite a broad topic. It is.
But yeah, no, it's definitely an area that people have a lot of opinions about, and a lot of people are aware of much more so than some of the other things we've done over the years.
This production was recorded at the podcast studios in the Media Arts Centre at Murdoch University. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Murdoch University. Any content provided by the hosts and guests are their personal opinions and are not intended to represent the views or opinions of the university, its administration, faculty, or staff. Now we have that out of the way, let's talk science. Paramount importance.
You're across a wide range of disciplines, including biochemistry and toxicology. Most of your recent research space has been in herbal medicines and dietary supplements. What does your research specifically focus on?
So this started about just over 10 years ago now, where a colleague contacted me and said, we've been looking at these traditional Chinese medicines that are imported into Australia. And they were looking at them from a DNA analysis perspective, trying to figure out what species were present within them. So, if it said it was plant X, did it have DNA from that plant in it, or were there other things potentially? And as part of that, they realized that they should probably also be looking at the other chemical composition within those things. So what other chemicals were there? And that was where my expertise in chemical analysis came in. And so we undertook a big study then, back in 2015 was when we did it. And that was where we looked at a range of different herbal medicines that were imported into Australia and found lots of different chemicals, and particularly a lot of medicines. So that got me really interested in, okay, well, what's actually in these products from a chemical perspective? And so originally our focus was very much on safety. So are these products actually safe for people to take? But one of the things we encountered was a lot of resistance from many people who are very passionate about their herbal medicines or their dietary supplements. So as a result of that, we changed the narrative. And so now our interest is actually, can we identify products that are of high quality so that people are able to take them knowing that they contain what they expect them to contain. So therefore, they have the potential to be effective. So we're very much interested in the composition and quality of herbal medicines and dietary supplements.
Right. Was the resistance general public or from like the brands selling the?
I mean, I think the industry body doesn't like to talk about safety because that might suggest that there is a safety issue. Mm-hmm. So from that was what really made me think, okay, maybe we need to change the way we talk about it and talk about quality instead, so that we can start to say, well, here's these Australian brands and they produce high quality products, for example. But at the same time, there are a lot of members of the public, and whenever we share this research on social media, for example, there are some people who do have very strong opinions. And I think sometimes people feel that, we want to stop them from taking herbal medicines, which is definitely not the case. What I want is for people to be able to make informed decisions. So if I'm going to choose to take a supplement, then I'm going to do some research and make sure that supplement actually does, that there's some evidence that it does what it says it does. And so that's the kind of information I'd like to be available to consumers more widely.
Right. So what are the methods you use to see what's supplements or what chemicals are in there?
So the main things that we use are some pretty straightforward or common technologies that are used for chemical analysis. So chromatography and mass spectrometry are the main techniques. So that's techniques that are used to separate and then measure small molecules, so small chemicals. So that's the standard way. For example, if you were to have a drug test as part of your job, that's the type of technology that would be used for that. So it's a way that enables us to measure what's present in them. We've used some other techniques over the years, but it primarily comes down to chromatography and mass spectrometry, which were initially developed, I think, a lot for the oil and gas industry, but in the last 20 or 30 years have really become a huge part of biological and chemical research more broadly.
Right. Are these also picking up like the quantities inside there?
Yeah. So depending on how you do the analysis, you can also measure the amounts. And so as a result of that, we can then say, okay, well, this contains these compounds and they are at levels that are potentially going to have an impact on the body, or sometimes they're at very low trace levels, which maybe just suggest that, they weren't being produced under the best manufacturing conditions. And I should say that most of the the very problematic things we found were products that were imported into Australia, so they were not actually approved for sale in Australia. When we've undertaken this research on Australian-made or products that are sold by Australian brands, our interest has more been, they say they contain this herb, for example, St. John's wort. Does it contain the active? Can we measure the active ingredients of St. John's wort at a level? So that's the sort of thing we're doing. We're not in any way suggesting that the products you buy from your pharmacy have been adulterated. What we're more interested in now is, do they actually contain enough of the herbal medicines to actually have a potential effect?
And what has your research found? Has it been pretty standard, or?
Look, I think so. Certainly, that initial research on the imported products was very concerning. There was a very high level of adulteration. So that's where pharmaceuticals like paracetamol, ibuprofen, or even things like antihistamines were clearly being added to these supposedly herbal products so that they would have the effect that they claim to have. So, if this product was claimed to be a herbal medicine that treated hay fever, often we would find a regular antihistamine had been added to it. And that's obviously not what it says on the packet. On the packet, it says it's a herbal product.
False advertising.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that was imported products. Then when we expanded the research to look at products that were sold within Australia, it was more often that we found that we certainly didn't find anywhere near that level of adulteration. We didn't find any of those sort of problems. We were instead finding, okay, sometimes those products don't seem to contain very much other than maybe rice or other cheap fillers. And then more recently, we've then been saying, okay, well, for the products that are really popular, do they actually have the active ingredients in? And if they do, is there enough there to have an effect? And what I think the data, not just our research, but globally, is showing that a lot of the time, if you isolate these compounds and add them to cells that you've grown in a dish, that you might see an effect. But when you take them into the body and they need to go through the digestive system and you've got all the bacteria there, they're going to change them chemically. Then it goes into your bloodstream and through the liver where it's going to get metabolized. Those changes mean that actually the amount that gets into your body is probably not going to be enough to have an impact.
Right. So you're finding are these the standard Australian standard medicines?
Yeah. So I think it's probably important to clarify how these products are regulated in Australia. Yeah. So if you go and buy an over-the-counter medicine like paracetamol, that's what we call a registered medicine. So that's a medicine that has been through a series of tests to demonstrate that it is safe and effective, and there's a certain amount of data that's required to do that. So all of those things like ibuprofen, those kind of medicines are what we call registered medicines. And you can see that if you pick up a packet of ibuprofen, you'll see in the corner somewhere it'll say AUST for Australia and then R for registered, and then there'll be a number. And you can go, any member of the public can go onto the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, the ARTG, and look up that product and confirm that it's registered for sale in Australia. There is a second class of products which is called listed medicines, and that's where you'll see AUST followed by an L and then a number. And listed medicines are products where they're not allowed to be sold making therapeutic claims. So you can't say this will cure your headache, but what you can say is things like traditionally used for the treatment of headache. So you can see the distinction there between the wording is, this will have this distinct effect, or this has been used for a long time to do this, but we're not actually saying that it does that. And so the level of evidence required for those products is a lot smaller, a lot lower, and it's typically more of a trust-based system. So if I wanted to sell a product, I would list it with the Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, and say, I have this evidence, but I don't actually have to provide the evidence to them.
Really? So they're untested medicines?
So there is, yes. So there are, obviously there is, if people were going to sell something that would be very toxic, then you would hope that the system would pick that up. But
what is this? How would the system pick something up?
Well,
like that?
Look, this is, and sometimes it sounds like I'm bashing the TGA, and I'm not. The TGA does a very big job with limited resources. So we know that there are limitations to what they can do. They do a certain amount of blind testing, so they'll go and buy products and test them, but it's a very small number of products. My understanding is that there's many thousands and thousands of products on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So even if they're only testing 100, it's still like a very small percentage. So this is where we think the importance of, we would like to see a higher level of testing, but we know that brings a cost to it, and this doesn't seem to be an area that is politically, is attracting a lot of attention. So therefore, it's unlikely the government's going to invest significantly more resources into the TGA. So for us, that's why we're trying to advocate for, okay, well, maybe we need some other testing approaches. That's why we do the work that we do, and try to develop maybe cheaper or higher throughput methods that people could use to screen these products. So that's why we've been looking at other technologies like nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which is not as sensitive as the normal techniques we use, but it's a lot faster. So maybe there's ways that we could do this analysis and just look for, key compounds in a faster, cheaper way that would allow more testing to be done.
How expensive is this testing? Like, what are you sort of talking about?
I mean, it's one of those things that there's always an economy of scale. If I have to buy an instrument to do the testing, the instrument is very expensive. But if I can buy the instrument and I'm analysing 100 samples a day, then obviously over time that means that the cost is spread out over a long period of time. So, if I wanted to get a very small number of samples tested, we could potentially be looking at $100 a sample. Whereas if we were able to do it at scale, then that brings the cost down substantially. So that's why there is a tension between, okay, yes, if we want more testing, there needs to be investment up front in the instrumentation, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. But over time, that pays for itself if you're able to test thousands and thousands of samples.
Right. So some of these listed medicines that you're talking about, are these ones that you just buy in Coles or at pharmacies as well? Are they just medicines that are everywhere?
Yep. So, typically anything that is a vitamin supplement will be a listed medicine. There are some that are registered because they have that high level of evidence, but so, vitamin supplements, the vast majority of herbal medicines as well. So, your weight loss supplements, your fish oils, which are obviously not herbal, they're animal, but you get the meaning. Mm-hmm. A lot of the products that are sold for things like memory and concentration, like the study aids, like Ginkgo, all of those sort of things fall under the category of listed medicines.
Right, but not. Some of them are tested and some are not.
Yeah, look, there's different levels of evidence, and some of these things have been used for a very long time, so there is a lot of evidence. And in other cases, they're things that haven't been very well studied, and so there is an opportunity for us to do more research.
What about like antibiotics and penicillins, all those kind of ones as well?
So anything that is what we call scheduled at a higher level, so you need a prescription for it, for example, or even just things that you typically need to talk to a pharmacist to receive, they would all be registered medicines because they've been through clinical trials which are documented to demonstrate both the safety and the effectiveness of them.
So this is mainly just supplements that is more worryingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big concern for us is that there's this, and of course you've got to remember that a lot of people are rightly or wrongly getting fed up with the conventional health system. People are either seeing that healthcare is very expensive or it's not accessible to them, which is obviously a problem that we need to address. And at the same time, we have a rise, particularly in countries like Australia, in non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, these sort of things that there's no easy treatment for. So you've got a lot more people who are looking to take a higher degree of control over their own healthcare. So that's why products that potentially claim, for example, to help you with weight loss are attractive, and we know that the market is growing. So that's really why the concern for us exists, is not that these products are there and they're a niche product. It's actually that the market is growing, and therefore we feel that there should be a greater degree of information available to the consumer.
Yeah, I'm sure anyone that listens to podcasts, nearly every sponsored ad is a supplement coming out. It's absolutely going berserk.
Exactly. And you've seen the growth of the industry, particularly since the pandemic. We saw a big spike in immune boosting supplements during the pandemic, so things that claim to help boost your immune system. But even before that, over the preceding decade before that, we were just seeing this continual increase. And it comes partly, again, from we know that there is a lack of trust in the pharmaceutical industry in some parts of society because, again, and certainly in some cases, maybe they haven't always acted in the best interests of communities, but at the same time, the evidence that's there in most cases is very strong that these products work. But, we saw the anti-vaccine movement very strongly during the pandemic, and that's a similar type of thing, which is a mistrust of this scientific approach. So therefore we want to take, and there's some big air quotes around this natural approach to use these supplements.
Right. You mentioned earlier about fillers.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just to make the tablet a decent size and not so small, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this the case where there's like a lot of these, unregistered brands just trying to get mass product out and they don't quite have the quantities in there? Was there any like discoveries of like quite well-known brands that were just such low amounts of what they said was in there that just...
Yeah, look, we've for legal reasons we haven't talked about the specific brands. What we tend to do is if we find a product that is concerning, we report it to the Therapeutic Goods Administration and allow them to undertake the investigation. And certainly some of the products that we have reported have either been withdrawn from sale or just mysteriously disappeared from sale, as if the manufacturer got the message. But certainly we did find products where the only, it said it contained a number of plants, but the only DNA we could detect was rice. So that suggested to us that it was probably mostly the cheap filler, mostly full of rice. The more concerning ones we found some instances where we'd find evidence of DNA that matched to nut species, and there was no nut allergy warning on the label. So that was obviously a concern for us, that there might be issues there. And in some cases we found DNA from gluten-containing species. And again, there was no gluten warning on the label. So again, for people with celiac disease, for example, there might be, again, it might be at very low levels because these are very sensitive analyses, but there might be enough in there for someone that they might have a reaction to it and then not realise because they didn't think that product might actually contain, for example, gluten or nuts.
That is very concerning. That's something I'd never...
No, and to be honest, we hadn't thought of it until we saw the results come through and went, oh, actually, that's a bit of a worry that there might be allergens, undisclosed allergens in these products, because we know how problematic it is when a food product gets recalled because there's potentially been allergens that have been detected. So that's definitely something that is worrying. Definitely.
Something else that's worrying. I did read an article that mentioned arsenic and cadmium and lead in medications such as paracetamol, antihistamines, anti-inflammatories, and antibiotics, and stimulants such as pseudoephedrine. So you found like some of these highly toxic chemicals inside.
Yeah, so that was in the traditional Chinese medicine work. So we looked at a heavy metal analysis for those, and we did find in some cases that those products contained much higher than recommended daily intake levels of either cadmium, arsenic, or lead. So, in most cases, if people are only taking 1 or 2 tablets, maybe, but some of these products would indicate that you should take 64 tablets a day, which we thought was quite a lot.
64 a day.
64 tablets a day. Yeah. So then that's where you've got this intersection between, okay, you're potentially taking a lot and they contain a lot of, a level of heavy metals that's higher than is considered safe. So again, that was the imported products. That's not products that were manufactured in Australia. But in that case, that was a big concern for us, that people might be exposed to toxic heavy metals. We know how important lead can be from a toxicity perspective, because we've seen issues with lead contamination in Western Australia. So it's something that we felt was a major issue. And there was one that did have very high levels of arsenic, and that was one of the ones that we did report to the TGA and did eventually get its registration withdrawn.
Right. And were these ones that were like found on shelves in supermarkets and stuff?
So the products from that initial study were purchased from a market in Adelaide. So it was a store that specialised in selling imported traditional Chinese medicines.
What is a traditional Chinese medicine, and how is that different to what we would find here?
So there's lots of different systems of traditional medicine around the world. Chinese medicine is one of the oldest medical systems in the world. There are others. There's a very long history of traditional medicine in India. Japan has a system that's a modification of the Chinese system that's happened over history. But basically, these are products that are I think a good way to say it is that if you wanted to undertake or to partake in traditional Chinese medicine, the way you would typically do it is to go and see a herbalist, and they would make these preparations for you, and that they would, based on what you said, they would make a dedicated preparation. And certainly, the evidence that we've read suggests that products that are produced in that way are probably safer. No guarantees, but they're probably safer than what we were looking at, which is products that are mass manufactured and imported into Australia and sold on a shelf. So they're sold in packaging that looks like, a vitamin supplement or another herbal medicine, and they're being purchased without any kind of consultation with a medical professional. So that's the type of product we're talking about here, is things that are purchased in specialist markets or other stores that import such products and sell them direct to consumers.
Right. And in terms of some of the more generic ones that we see on the shelves in here, has there been any concerning, apart from the fillers, like toxic chemicals or anything inside them? Or
certainly not like that. There have been concerns raised by others about workout supplements. Some workout supplements seem to contain stimulants that are not explicitly illegal, but they're very similar to other things like ephedrine, pseudoephedrine that are controlled, are heavily controlled. So there have been concerns raised about some of those products. I think our bigger concern with the products we looked at that you could purchase in Australia from health food stores, pharmacies, supermarkets is a combination of, a lot of the time they don't contain measurable levels of what's listed on the label. So for us, that was, they're probably not a safety risk, but they're definitely a waste of money. But another study that we have recently completed was simply looking at the labels and whether the labels of these products complied, because there are specific regulations that you need to comply with. And we found something in the 90% range were in some way or another not compliant with the labeling regulation. So that to us was a concern, because then we have reason to doubt that consumers are not getting accurate information about the products that they're taking.
Yeah, right. I think that would be legal.
Yeah, and so they technically don't meet the legal requirements to be sold in Australia. And, it's because of the way the system works, where the onus is on the person selling the product. So it's not necessarily the manufacturer. It's what's called the sponsor. It's the person who wants to sell the product in Australia. So they might be manufacturing it or they might be buying it from another manufacturer. But the onus is on them to keep the information on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods up to date. And it's not actually that hard to find products in the stores that don't have the correct information on the ARTG. So again, that's a concern, not necessarily because the listing is wrong and therefore it's a major risk to consumers, but it just suggests to us that there's a lack of care being taken in how these products are sold. Because I would want to know, if someone's selling me this product and they say it contains these things, that they are doing everything that they're required to do to make sure this product is approved for sale in Australia.
Yeah, definitely, especially if people are relying on it for their health. Yeah. This is probably a little bit of a silly question, but how accurate is the testing? Is the contaminants, I'm guessing that one's probably an easy one to eliminate, but when you're getting, because there's a broad range of chemicals and everything inside there, how easy is it to dissociate the different chemicals?
Look, and you've hit on one of the biggest challenges that we have in any kind of chemical analysis, is that the more complex the chemical mixture gets, the more challenging the analysis is. By far and away, the hardest ones to work with are things like fish oils, because the oil medium is just so different than, if you get a tablet, you can grind it up, dissolve it in some liquid and analyze it, whereas the fish oils and other things like krill oil and stuff are really hard to work with, not only because they really smell really bad when you cut the fish oil tablets open, but also just because it's really hard to get anything out, anything meaningful extracted from those oils, partly because of the process they've been through to convert it from a fish into an oil. So that was a challenge.
Do you know that process? Because I actually have always wondered how do they do that.
Look, there's a range of different ways you can do it, but it would probably start with grinding up the fish, and then you do some sort of separation between the oil-soluble components and the water-soluble components, and eventually you're left with a purified oil. I don't think it's a pretty process.
No, my imagination was not pretty.
Yeah, no, exactly. So you're right. Look, there's no one chemical analysis technique that gives you all the answers. That's one of the reasons why we've tried different techniques over the years. When things that are at really low levels, it's hard to get an accurate measurement on it. But I guess in the type of analysis we're talking about, things that are at really low levels are probably less of a concern than things that are at really high levels. But this is a big problem with the standardization of these products. If I grow a herb, let's say I grow St. John's wort, which is actually a really effective antidepressant. So there's some clinical studies that suggest it's as effective as, regular antidepressants. You should never take them together. And unfortunately, Sir John's wort interacts with a whole bunch of other medications as well. So it's difficult to recommend to people because we know that there's a bunch of other medications that it either makes them more effective or less effective. So it is tricky. But let's use that as an example. If we were to grow St. John's wort here and then we grew it in another country, let's say we grew it in New Zealand, the climate is different, the soil is different, the chemical content of the water is different. So all those things mean that the actual chemical composition of the eventual herb that we extract is going to be very different. So, if you go and buy paracetamol off the shelf in Australia and you go buy paracetamol off the shelf in New Zealand, it's going to have the same amount of paracetamol in it because it's a very chemically simple medicine. Whereas when we talk about herbal medicines, we're talking about things that might contain thousands of different chemicals that were produced in the plant or multiple plants that are mixed together. So that means that from one batch to another or from one brand to another, the amount of the different chemicals might be wildly different. And so that, again, does create challenges for the chemical analysis and is one of the reasons why we do have concerns about these types of products because there's for some of them, there's no degree of standardization. For some, they might be standardized to one active ingredient, which is good, but that means all the other thousands of chemicals that are in there are not standardized. So that's obviously concerning.
Right. This is actually quite interesting because what I did in the last podcast last week was with Anish who does the soil microbiome. Yep. And there's probably definitely a connection with that from there, from where the plants acquire or the acquisition from their soil microbiome that goes in through the plants.
Yep.
And
it would definitely be one of the factors that would mean that a plant that we grow in Australia is different to even a plant that we grow in Western Australia is probably going to be very different than the same plant grown on the East Coast, for example.
Yeah, definitely. It's crazy that there's a connection between the two. But going back to the herbal medicines, because you can also synthesize some of these ingredients, right? Is that a better option?
I mean, there's a long history of plants in particular, also animals, but especially plants being the source for some of our most important medicines, and fungi, but not forget the fungi. That's where we get penicillin from, for example. So there's lots of examples of where we've identified what we call a natural product. So that's something that's produced by an organism that has therapeutic potential. Some of our most effective cancer treatments come from plants. So there is absolutely a long history of taking plants, identifying the chemical composition, figuring out what the active ingredient is, and then either producing it on scale, just like happened during World War II when they started to produce, penicillin at a massive industrial scale, or producing a synthetic form. Now, sometimes that can be really expensive, but in other times it's the only potential option to produce enough of it. So that's where we know that there is an active ingredient that has a clear pharmacological benefit. That is absolutely a way that has potential to be, certainly it's going to be easier for us to guarantee that an individual is getting the dose that we want them to get.
Right. And so how like the active ingredient that gets standardized, so that's usually they will be the regulated under the TGA.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. What you often find is that internationally, people have agreed that this is the active ingredient and we're all going to standardize our products to this active ingredient. It's less of a you must do this and more of an accepted practice, for example. So ginseng, I think, is one where you often have it standardized to a certain level of ginsenosides, which are the active chemicals in ginseng.
Right. Does part of your research also then look into like the health of the occupant or the health of the people taking it and their like impact on them long term?
So that's where we've started to go more recently. So we've been really interested in weight loss supplements recently because they're obviously a huge industry. Unfortunately, the best way, people always ask me, have you found any that work? Unfortunately, the best way to lose weight remains diet and exercise, unfortunately. There are a lot of products that are very popular, and green tea extract is one of them. So that's a product that we know that has there's a lot of claims about it being good for weight loss, whereas certainly, and again, if you look into the evidence, there are individual chemicals within that plant that in isolation potentially have a benefit. They can change the way your body metabolizes fat, for example. But what there isn't is the high degree of evidence that if an individual takes this, it is going to potentially help them to lose weight. And the bigger concern about something like green tea extract is that we now know that so everybody processes chemicals in a slightly different way. So foreign chemicals that come into the body primarily are metabolized in your liver. Your liver expresses lots of different enzymes. And it's become very clear over recent decades that different people from different ethnic backgrounds, even the difference between biological men and women, for example, is biological male and female, I should say, is that your liver will have different levels of the different enzymes, which means that you might take medicine X and I take it and you might metabolize it within 5 hours, but I might take 8 hours to break it down. Now, those are the sort of differences that we see. And what we've now come to learn is that there is a particular genetic factor that means that some people respond really badly to green tea extract to the point of potential liver transplant. There's been 6 or 7 at least reported cases of liver transplant in Australia in the last couple of decades that are causally linked to herbal supplements. So this is where people are having a very extreme reaction because their body is converting these things into something toxic. So that's obviously a big concern for us, is that some individuals, and it's not a big number, but the problem is that it's not like we're getting everybody genetically tested so we can say to people, well, you shouldn't take this. Unfortunately, the only way we find out is someone takes it and they start to get symptoms of liver damage, which is usually the only indication that they are one of the people for whom this is a toxic product. So that's the direction we're trying to go now, is to start to understand, okay, if we assume that these are a big part of our health system, can we start to identify, okay, these are the products that we think are potentially safe, and we're not going to make claims about whether they work or not at this stage. What we're looking at is, are they safe for you to take? And if we think they're safe, then hopefully then people can consume them with no negative impacts. But in some cases, like we've seen with green tea extract, that the risk probably outweighs the benefits. Helpfully, the Therapeutic Goods Administration does review these products on a semi-regular basis. And a couple of years ago, they'd put out a call for submissions on green tea extract, which myself and my colleagues put a submission in. And it looks like, based on all the submissions that came in, they are actually going to increase the scheduling of green tea extract. So it's going to probably at least be behind the counter in a pharmacy. So people will have to talk to a pharmacist before they are able to actually access these products. Right.
One quick question is so what is the difference between green tea and green tea extract? But then I wanted to know where does it become the limit? Because you sort of touched on it, that people's way that they break down, this is, I know, very off to that first question, but is it to do with their lineage on how they metabolize these ingredients?
So to answer your first question, basically, green tea is you get a tea bag and you make a cup of tea. Green tea extract is I'm potentially taking the equivalent of tens or even hundreds of cups of tea and extracting out the active ingredients and putting them into a tablet form. So it's effectively the equivalent of having lots of cups of tea all at once. So that's where the challenge to the body comes from, is, if you have a cup of tea, okay, there's going to be some what are called catechins. They're the active ingredients. There's probably going to be some tannins. There might be a bit of caffeine, but they're at the level that you would expect from the infusion from a tea bag. It's when you take the extract in its concentrated form, and this is what the TGA is proposing to change. They're not going to make it harder to buy a cup of tea, but they want to regulate these products where, I think there's at least one that's maybe 300 times what you would find in a single cup of tea in per dose sort of thing. So it's that very high level that is of concern.
What is that used for? What are the people take them for?
So it's certainly been very popular for its supposed benefits to weight loss, because it is claimed to help burn fat. They're what they call thermogenic, so it helps you burn fat from the body. Again, if you look at the data, you can probably see that happening if you isolate some fat cells and you put the green tea extract or even the active ingredient. There's a compound called EGCG. You put it on them. Actually, it does change the fat metabolism. But there's no evidence that if I take it as a tablet, that enough of it gets into my body to actually have a significant effect on weight loss. So that's the difference. Your other question, it is primarily a genetic predisposition to. So this was only found out in the last couple of years. They figured out what particular gene was probably responsible for the people who metabolize this product in the way that generates the toxic compound, versus most of us who metabolize it in a way that's safe for the body. So that's most likely is because of their genetic background.
That is crazy that like some people could just generate toxic compound when other people don't. This is also, I'm assuming, the case for a lot of other different medicines or like vaccines and everything as well, I would assume.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we often forget is that the human population is hugely diverse. You know, yes, we're all very much the same at a genetic level in some respects, but our individual biochemistry is very different. And a lot of the time, you know, we don't even have data on the difference between how male and female bodies will metabolize different, even medicines. A lot of the time studies are done on, you know, healthy young men, and women are often excluded, or historically have been, partly because they didn't want to carry the risk of, if someone became pregnant during a drug trial, they didn't know what the impact of the drug would be on the unborn child. So you can understand the ethical reason why that was probably done, but it means that we've got this huge gap in our understanding of at least 50% of the population in terms of how their bodies metabolize medicines and even conventional medicines. So there is a big gap that we have that means that if we don't know that for things that are well understood, like, you know, your ibuprofen or your penicillin, then what don't we know about these really complex mixtures? It makes it so much harder for us to generate that level of information.
Yeah. So what is the limit when you have to get to before you're about to administer these drugs? Like, is it like 1 in 10,000 people are affected, or one, like bigger, smaller? Like what? Look,
there's a whole separate group of toxicologists who are regulatory toxicologists, which is an area that I certainly don't have that expertise in. But the goal of that is this type of risk analysis, is understanding, okay, if people are exposed to a level of, and a lot of the time, you know, this work is driven by environmental pollutants, for example. So if we were to use, you know, maybe heavy metals as an example, if you're exposed to this level of mercury, then that's probably not going to have a negative impact on you. So therefore, that's how we set the safe limit. Now, this is something that is done in consultation with bodies around the world. Some countries have stricter limits than others. So look, that's a whole big field of toxicology that, and again, you know, it does have its own challenges. You know, one of the problems we have is that a lot of this type of risk analysis work has typically been done using animals. And as a society, you know, we probably are at a position now where, like, well, actually animal testing is not something that we want to do as much as possible. So we have to find that balance between, okay, how do we get the toxicology data while using as few animals as possible, or are there alternatives? And so these are called NAMs, New Approach Methodologies. I've got a colleague at the University of Sydney who does a lot of work in this space, trying to develop new methods. So either, you know, can we grow cells in a dish, like human cells in a dish, or can we even do this in a computer to help us predict, okay, if you expose a human to this level of this chemical, then this is probably what's going to happen. So that's where the science is very much going to try and get better and better at those risk assessments.
How accurate is that?
Look, it's actually becoming more and more accurate, particularly with the rise, and I hate to bring that into every conversation we have, but with the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, that we can, the more data we have, because obviously we have a lot of data that's been collected over the last sort of 100 years of modern science, that if we can start to feed that data into these models, then our predictions can get more and more accurate. We're certainly not at a point yet where we're going to replace all of our other risk assessment processes with computer models, but it's something that's being actively worked on around the world.
Well, so there's good science for the future, but I had no idea about that either. I actually pretty much don't have any idea about what we're talking about.
That's why we have the podcast.
Yeah, everything's very new and it's absolutely outstanding. What level does it have to get to before you do those like human trials? Because I have a lot of friends that they've gone, I think it's to the hospital or somewhere where they do those drug trials and they stay there for three or 4 nights and they get $2,000 or whatever it is. What level does it have to be to go to that?
Look, I think certainly we're starting to see in some parts of the world that there is a growing desire to undertake these types of controlled studies on herbal supplements. One of the challenges remains which herbal supplements, because we've already talked about that maybe if I buy this brand versus this brand, the composition might be slightly different. So that's why we've tried to take this approach of, well, maybe if we can figure out what chemicals are in them and whether they're effective, we can at least get to some sort of, okay, these are the compounds we should be focusing on. If we can get to some sort of standard level, then I think that's going to be the next step in the process. And then from that, I think we're not too far away from some large, and they are happening, but from some more large scale clinical trials of these types of products.
Right. Okay. So they're like a pretty relatively safe.
Well, I mean, you got to remember a lot of these things are, being consumed by thousands, if not millions of people around the world. So that, there is a lot of data that suggests that, well, if there was a massive toxicity problem, you would think that we would have seen it by now.
Yeah.
So, while I'm not trying to talk myself out of a job, at least trying not out to scare people into stopping taking their supplements. What we want people to do is to actually do the research and say, okay, is this product actually effective? Is there evidence that it's safe? Are there any risks that I should be aware of before I start taking this product?
Is there any ingredients that you suggest we should stay away from?
Well, I mean, obviously, with what's happening in the space around green tea extract, I think it's an area that people need to be very conscious of if they're going to use a green tea extract supplement. At the very least, monitoring yourself, and if you start to feel unwell, ensuring that you report that to your GP, because one of the biggest challenges is underreporting. People take a supplement, it makes them feel sick, they stop taking it, they don't mention it to anyone. And they're obviously okay, but what we really want is for them to tell their pharmacist or their GP so that can be reported. So then we have a better idea of, okay, what's the prevalence of these adverse reactions? How common really is it? So I think, there's that, it's that gap that we have at the moment between, okay, thousands of people take these products, and some people have a bad reaction. What we want to do is to bridge that gap to know, okay, is it enough that we should be putting a warning label on these products, or we should be changing how they're scheduled? So for me, green tea extract definitely falls into that category. Like I've said, St. John's wort is one that in itself is quite effective, but the interactions with other medicines are a real concern. So that's one that we always encourage people to look out for. Certainly there are things like, there's a product called black cohosh, which is used for I think it's primarily used for reproductive health, but that's had some toxicity concerns. There's another weight loss one called Garcinia, which has been withdrawn. Products with that have been withdrawn. So there's a few products like that. Certainly for me, the bigger one is the products that are just not effective. There's no evidence that they're effective. It's a lot of the ones that are supposed to help you concentrate, things like ginkgo. Again, there's just no evidence that they're effective, more effective than a placebo when you do a trial, than when the trials have been done.
Right.
So
Okay.
those are the ones. Another one is echinacea that people will often say they take to help with a cold. Again, there's no evidence that it's actually effective at reducing the duration of a cold, certainly from the studies that I've seen.
Right. And it's also, I guess, a lot of the ingredients you find that are quite toxic, they're hidden in there.
Yeah.
They're not, it's just contaminants.
And it's the susceptible population that we're concerned about. For a lot of the time it's, okay, yeah, most people are going to take this and they're going to be fine, but we don't currently have a way to predict who's going to have a bad reaction to it. So at the very least, that's why we want greater awareness, so that if people go, oh, actually, I'm not feeling great lately. Oh, I started taking a new supplement. Maybe it's that. That's the kind of link that we would be encouraging people to make, so that they can go, oh, okay, I'll stop taking that.
Do you think in the future that they'll have this contains this, if you're a part of this lineage, please don't take it?
I mean, the health system overall is slowly moving towards what we would call personalized medicine. So the idea that rather than treating you as a member of a population, we treat you as an individual. Because, as we've talked about, a lot of our understanding of how drugs work comes from relatively small populations of people. The same goes for if you have a blood test and they test the levels of different, things in your bloodstream as a measure of your health. That's based on, they'll put you into a bucket. Okay, you're in this level, you're in the normal range. But the more and more evidence we get suggests actually the normal range is probably a lot broader than we think. And what's a healthy range of, say, vitamin D for you might be very different than a healthy range of vitamin D from someone who lives in a country where the sun never comes out. So if you, we've seen people come from the United Kingdom, for example, to Australia, and they were considered to be normal vitamin D levels in the UK. They're considered deficient in Australia because our levels are naturally higher because we're out in the sunshine a lot more. So the more information we can get on understanding an individual, So that means that the tests need to get cheaper so that we can do more tests on an individual. And we also need to be able to look at how people's bodies change over time. Because there's no point in me measuring the vitamin D levels in your body today and saying, I think you're deficient. What I need to know is how have the vitamin D levels in your body changed over years. And if it's constant, then that's probably the normal level for your body. That's the type of thing that we want to get towards, is an understanding of you as an individual rather than you as a person who fits into this bucket that we think is the normal range.
Right. So to be able to do that, do we need to go get like a blood test now and have our like on file?
I mean, I think that's very much where medicine is going. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a fundamental change from how medicine currently operates, and it would require a change in how medicine is funded, because obviously there will be additional expenses associated with it if people were having blood tests on a more regular basis. I'm certainly not advocating that. But at the same time, what I do say to people is if you think you're deficient in something, talk to your GP about it rather than necessarily saying, I think I'm deficient in vitamin B6. I'm going to take a vitamin B6 supplement. Maybe, if you're able, go to the GP. And I know not everyone's able to go to the GP on a regular basis because it does cost money, but have a conversation with your GP, get a blood test. If it comes back that you are deficient, then consider taking a supplement rather than just necessarily going and buying a supplement off the shelf if you think you might be deficient because you read something.
One of the biggest ones that I'm hearing lately is about testosterone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is there any risks, or like, have you been in that area, looking into that lately, or?
Look, I think reproductive hormones, steroid hormones are a different area. They are something like, testosterone it has an impact on a lot of different parts of the human body. So it's something that I would always approach with caution. I think there are a lot of supplements out there that will claim to boost your testosterone levels. I certainly haven't seen anything particularly convincing as yet. Again, this is something that people need to be aware of. Yes, your testosterone levels are going to decline over time. So it is something as you age that you do need to discuss with your GP, because that does have potential health impacts on you. But again, for me, it would be, okay, do I think my testosterone levels are declining? Okay, well, I'll get a test, and based on the test, then I'll talk to my GP about the options. I do understand that people sometimes like to take control of their own health. That's where, in the case of something like testosterone, which absolutely has benefits. So, for example, if you're trying to build muscle, but also has other impacts on the body, we know it's involved in regulating reproduction, other parts of the body as well. That's one that I would tread carefully around because of the potential side effects.
Right.
It's any steroid hormone has a lot of potential side effects that you want to be careful about how you're and of course it's buying actual testosterone is highly restricted because it's something that has such a high potential for abuse, potentially, especially in, like a high performance sport type scenario. So it's not something you can just go and buy testosterone, but you might be buying supplements that claim to boost testosterone.
Mm. With the supplement, a lot of people import them, as we mentioned earlier, like to bypass, to get higher concentrations or anything like that. Is that a way that people can just like import drugs, like the illicit drugs?
Look, I mean,
have you
obviously,
ever come across something like that?
Certainly, we know that there have been some parts of the internet that have been used for that. So there certainly have been people buying illicit drugs online. There are certainly people who buy pharmaceutical medications online and supplements as well. Now, there are different levels of regulation around these things. Obviously, it's never legal to buy illicit drugs, anything that's considered to be illegal, but that then falls to our customs and import system to pick up. So it unfortunately does remain a way that people are bringing these products into the country, and again is probably a mix between people are fed up with the health system, so they're trying to take matters into their own hands, and also they read stuff online that says, this product's amazing, you should buy this product, and people buy it without necessarily thinking about it. And then again, that's where I say, look, if you want to take it, I'm not going to stop you, but what I want you to do is do some reading first. Google the name of the product and safety. Google the name of the product and adverse reaction or recall, the sort of terms that we might associate with negative outcomes, and see what comes up, because you might find, actually this product has had a lot of people reporting negative impacts. Maybe I won't take that.
Is there a source that you particularly recommend as well?
Look, I mean, once you're getting into things that are sold online, that's getting a bit trickier because they don't fall under Australian regulation per se. So that is a tricky one. That is a tricky one. Certainly looking at similar agencies to the Therapeutic Goods Administration, so the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA in the United States, which has obviously got its own challenges with the current administration in the United States, is potentially going to change how they do things, but they have always been a world leader in this sort of space. So looking at them, the European Medicines Authority is another one. I think it's the authority. The European Medicines Group is another one that has, because they've got all those European countries, has a lot of data. So certainly looking for government sources. Again, I know some people don't trust government sources necessarily. Government sources or things that are peer-reviewed, so actual published science rather than necessarily opinion is a good place to start. And again, I know those types of things can sometimes be difficult to read if you don't have a scientific background, but that's where it's the sort of thing that maybe you can discuss with your pharmacist or your GP, because they will both have had some exposure to this type of thing as part of their training.
Okay, right. In another field of your research, I read a paper about methamphetamine effects on rat neuroblastoma cells to understand the biochemical impacts of acute methamphetamine exposure. Can you please explain this? Because this one stood out to me.
So one of the technologies that we use is sort of a biochemistry approach called metabolomics, which is so we talked about blood tests. So you might get a blood test and they might measure 6 or 8 different things in your bloodstream. One of the things that we've been trying to do as part of a global collective of people is to really expand that out and look at as many different chemicals in a sample as we can. So, in blood sample, we might look at hundreds or even thousands of different biomolecules. So all the amino acids, all the fats, or certainly the fatty acids, carbohydrates, all those sort of things. And the goal of that is to get a much clearer picture of the biochemistry of whatever organism we're looking at. In that case, it was rat cells that we, so they're an immortalized cell. We didn't actually use animals for that. We bought the cells. Or it might be in a blood sample or a urine sample.
What's an immortalized cell?
Sorry, an immortalized cell is a cell that has been, so the classic example is a cancer cell. So we know that the problem with cancer is that the cells divide over and over and over and over again with nothing slowing them down, which is why they turn into a tumor. And so if you take a cell, so that's a neuroblastoma, so that's a nerve tumor. If you take cancer cells, then you're able to grow them over and over again in the lab without them stopping growing, because normal cells will grow for a bit, but then they reach maturity and they stop.
Why would you use those cells?
Because it means we can use them over and over again without having to kill animals. So.
Right. Wouldn't people donate their blood for science for this?
So that does happen as well. There's definitely work that is undertaken on donated human tissue and cells. But again, you can only grow them for a short period of time before they stop growing. It's just part of the biology is that eventually cells go, I'm not actually in my normal environment. I'm not happy now. I'm going to stop growing. So look, it does have its limitations as a model. It's not necessarily 100% representative of what you would find in a living organism. But for us, it's a way of doing this type of research without using animals, because we're trying to minimize our use of animals and move into other areas. So one of the things we're looking at is how accurate is the data we get from this.
Why can't you use the immortal cells from like a human can?
Oh, we absolutely do. In fact, now we use human cells. So there's when we first started, we were using rat cells because the colleague I was working with had come from a pharmaceutical background and they mostly used rat models. Whereas now for the work we're doing on supplements, we're primarily using human liver and nerve cells to look at the impacts on the liver and the brain.
Oh, okay, right. So going back to that study though, because is it the methamphetamine that you find in like ADHD drugs and all that kind of stuff? Well,
so you've got dexamphetamine is the form that's used in medications. Mm-hmm. Methamphetamine is the more addictive form that is a much more controlled substance. So where that project actually came from was that we had a student who came to us and said, look, I'm really interested. Friends of mine have been going to places in Southeast Asia and taking methamphetamine and drinking lots of Red Bull because they said that the caffeine makes the amphetamine even more effective.
Right.
And we were like, wow, that's really interesting. Mm. And at the same time, we were looking for a reason to test this new approach. So what we thought was, well, we've got the cells, we've got the technology, let's use methamphetamine as a model for it and see, okay, if we expose these cells to methamphetamine, and measure as much of the biochemistry as we can. Are the changes that occur similar to what you would see in other studies that have used more established methods? So we were trying to basically say, look, hey guys, here's a new method over here that gives you more information, and the data that it gives you is actually even more sort of comprehensive than you would get from an old school study. So that was the reason we undertook that research. And certainly at the time, the data that we got was really encouraging. A couple of the colleagues moved on to other universities, so we didn't carry on with that research as far as we had originally intended to. But certainly, in fact, and then I think was it last year? Last year we published another study where we looked at liver cells and we exposed them to, in that case, it was hydrogen peroxide, which is you would find in where you buy as a chemical, you can buy as a chemical, but is also produced in cells when they get stressed, and we know it's toxic. So we were using a similar approach of saying, okay, how much of the biochemistry can we look at, and are the changes that we see the same as what we would expect if this was happening in a whole animal, with the goal being eventually we'd like to get to, okay, we don't need to use animals anymore. We can use these cell-based methods and these computer-based methods to predict toxicity.
Right. And that's where it's come to now, is it?
Yeah, so we got some good data out of the recent studies, and we've got some more analysis to do. But certainly at the moment, it's looking like we're getting some really relevant data that hopefully will eventually allow us to say, hey, here's a new model that people can use instead of animals.
Right. So that study was more looking at the method more than actually the response.
Yeah, I mean, look, we were obviously interested in what the response was, but we were primarily interested in it from how does this compare to what other people have found, so that we can start to say, yeah, this method's a good one. This is something that people could use instead of animal models, because that's really what we, as a group of toxicologists, would like to be able to move away from using animals.
Right. Okay. If you had unlimited time and funding, what research project would you pursue? I
think the work that we've been doing on the weight loss supplements is really important, because we know it's a growing area. And I think what you've talked about undertaking some studies where we actually get people to take these products, obviously only if we knew that they were going to be safe for the individuals, but actually seeing the impact biochemically. So again, now combining these two strands, so actually bringing these biochemistry techniques that we've been developing together with the supplement work to say, okay, if you take this is what happens to your body. This is how your body responds metabolically. And so from that, we can then start to say, okay, yes, actually I can see a way that this product might actually be effective, or the changes that we're seeing are not what we would expect if you were losing weight, or it had improved how your body responds to glucose, for example. So that's the type of thing. And to do that, because we've already talked about the fact that we have lots of gaps in our understanding, we'd have to do it in a fairly large scale. We'd have to have a big population of diverse people so that we can actually capture the diversity that exists within the human population. That's, I think, where we'd love to be able to take the research to really understand the potential benefits and risks to the broader human population.
Right. What about hair loss ones?
Look, that's
a big one as well.
That's interesting. That's not something that I've specifically looked at, but that's a very good point, actually, that there is certainly cosmetic things are an area where we know people are willing to spend a lot of money. So there exists the potential for people to take advantage of that. So that's certainly an area that I haven't looked at, but that actually, is a really good point. It does warrant some further investigation. I'm going to go and look into that. Thank you.
No dramas. I guess actually on this next question, I probably know the answer to this one. You mentioned it earlier. What is your least favorite type of medicine or supplement or drug do you least like to test?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we discussed earlier, anything in the oil category is the one, because they smell bad. The smell gets on your hands, even if you're wearing gloves, and they're just really hard to actually get anything meaningful out of because of the composition of them. So that's an area where, if we had, again, unlimited resources, investing in some new ways to extract the chemicals out of those oils so that we could get some more data, there's definitely some more work that could be done there. Again, to get to the point of, okay, these are the high quality products that have got the right fatty acids that are going to have the potential health benefits that people are seeking.
This has come to the end of the program, but thank you so much for coming in today. This has been amazing.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's always happy to come and talk about the science that we do.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to follow up again. I've just learned so much from today, and I'm sure once this goes out, there's probably going to be a whole bunch more questions.
Yeah, well, we've got some more studies that we're hoping to get published over the next year, so it'd be good to check back in with you once those are out and let you know what else we've found.
Definitely. Are they open access?
As much as possible, we publish open access, but if there's ever anything that people are interested in that they can't get access to, you can always contact me and I'm happy to send them a copy.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much.
Power Mountain Pool.